On a cold Monday in late March 2003, Clayton Jordan parked his 1994 Chevrolet K2500 at the Conrad dealership with 312,000 miles on the odometer, rust crawling along both rocker panels, and a driver door that only opened if he reached across and pushed it from the inside first. He stepped out in patched brown coveralls, one knee stitched twice with mismatched thread, and boots darkened by old grease. Inside the glass-front showroom, Brent Halverson stood near a polished, articulated tractor under bright lights. Clean cap, clean jacket, clean fingernails, the whole visual language of modern credit confidence as Clayton read it. Clayton walked past the new inventory and stopped at the back lot where a cracked frame 1978 Steiger Cougar sat tagged at $9,800. The paint was faded, the cab's seals were brittle, and one rear tire had weather checking deep enough to hold a finger. Brent laughed not loudly, but with the kind of practiced certainty Clayton had heard before from men who expected urgency to end in signatures. He flipped open a folder and pointed Clayton toward a new four-wheel drive model priced at $186,400. 10 years at 7.9%, Brent said, would land at $2,236 per month. He moved quickly through the script, mentioning tax treatment, uptime, resale value, and serious farming. Clayton listened, hands in his pockets, then gave Brent 12 words without raising his voice. If iron is paid for, weather cannot repossess it. He signed for the Steiger, arranged a haul, and left with a bill of sale that looked to everyone else in that office like proof he was falling behind. The misjudgment traveled faster than planting weather. By evening, coffee tables from Marshall County to Grundy County had the same version of the story. Clayton had finally gotten too tight to keep up. He was 58, running 620 acres split between owned and rented ground, and still driving that rusted truck. In local conversation, appearance had already reached a verdict. Clayton did not arrive at that dealership by accident, and he did not arrive there unprepared. He was born in 1945 outside Albion, the second of 3 children, and by age 12 he could grease a planter and set a cultivator without being told twice. The defining lesson came much later, in January 1985, when he stood at the edge of a neighbor's farm auction, in wind that cut through chore coats, and watched the auctioneer move through assets that had taken 40 years to build. The neighbor, Harold Pike, had borrowed across 3 expansion cycles. 1 note was fixed. 2 were variable. When rates climbed and 2 poor yield years overlapped, cash flow snapped. Harold was not reckless. He was diligent and exhausted. That distinction never left Clayton. By spring 1986, Clayton was farming 160 rented acres at $82 per acre. Total annual rent, $13,120. He bought a used International Harvester, 1,086 for $8,700 cash, a 6-row planter for $1,350, and put $420 into opener blades and chains. That same year, his corn averaged 131 bushels per acre, sold at $1.94 per bushel, and soybean ground averaged 39 bushels at $5.24. Gross revenue was $64,982. After rent, seed, fertilizer, fuel, repairs, and family living, he closed the year with $6,140 left. Most people saw a small number. Clayton saw a base layer. He married Denise in 1988. They lived in a farmhouse with original windows, 1 bathroom, and a furnace that needed coaxing every November. Their first full-year household budget became an operating principle. Food, $4,860, utilities, $2,140, clothing $380, truck insurance $620, church and local giving $540, total $8,540. They did not confuse modest living with deprivation. They called it margin. From 1989 through 1995, he stacked those margins with a discipline that looked dull from the road and powerful on paper. 1989, net saved $11,300. 1990, net saved $14,900. 1991, bought 40 acres from an absentee owner for $44,000 cash after 2 years of stage payments. 1992, tiled 22 wet acres for $6,600 paid on completion. 1993, crop shortfall, net saved only $4,200, no loan opened. 1994, bought the Chevrolet K2500 used for $7,200 with 96,000 miles. 1995, pre-bought nitrogen in December at a lower posted price, saving $2,480 before spring application even began. The sequence was not dramatic, but it produced a durable result. By his mid-50s, Clayton had zero term equipment debt and enough liquidity to make decisions without asking a banker for permission. Denise passed in 1999 after a brief illness, and that year narrowed the farm down to essentials. Clayton reduced custom work, kept only what he could maintain himself, and moved 2 old ledgers into the kitchen drawer where he paid bills. Eli and Mason were old enough to notice that grief and money were being handled by the same method. No panic, no performance, no denial, just numbers and next steps. In 2000 and 2001, with corn prices weak, he still avoided operating debt by adjusting fertilizer timing, delaying non-critical repairs, and renting 1 less quarter rather than forcing a break-even acreage expansion. His thesis was simple and non-negotiable. A bad market is survivable. A bad market plus mandatory payments is where good families break. By 2003, Clayton could hear that thesis being challenged almost everywhere he stopped. At the co-op counter and sale barns, operators compared attractive terms and bigger horsepower, and tax preparers talked up accelerated depreciation over coffee after church. Brent Halverson's pitch fit that moment, and Clayton did not dismiss it as foolish. He had listened closely enough to know the service program was real and that some neighbors were posting short-term efficiency gains. But in Clayton's notebook, the pressure point always sat in timing. Brent's plan fixed cash outflow every month. Clayton's plan preserved seasonal flexibility, even when income swung with weather and basis. Both were coherent systems in his mind. Only one, as he had learned from men like Harold Pike, could ride multi-year volatility without asking a lender for mercy. 2 weeks after the Steiger purchase, spring rain delayed fieldwork and compressed every schedule window. Then Clayton's old 2-wheel drive tillage tractor dropped a transmission. Agronomy projections from the local extension office suggested he had 9 viable planting days left before expected corn yield loss approached 11 bushels per acre. At a local cash price of $2.38, that was $26.18 per acre in expected gross revenue pressure, or roughly $16,231 across 620 acres if delays spread. The same week, the cooperative posted a fertilizer prepay requirement of $41,760 due by April 30th. Brent returned with a revised offer, 6.9% if Clayton signed that day. The message was clear. Borrow now or miss the season. Clayton chose the path that looked poorer and was financially harder in the short run. He spent $6,240 on parts, found a salvage differential for $1,180, and put 96 labor hours into the Steiger, with 2 hired evenings of welding at $65 per hour. Total resurrection cost, $7,420 plus labor. He tracked every line item in a green notebook. Seals, $440. Hydraulic hose and fittings, $690. Clutch work, $1,160. Fluids and filters, $530. Tire patch and service call, $310. Electrical cleanup, $220. And the rest in mixed hardware and machine shop time. He also accepted weekend custom ripping at $18 per acre on neighboring ground, adding cash flow without opening a note. By the second week of April 2003, the Cougar was running warm but steady. Pulling through ground people assumed it would never touch again. Clayton still wore patched coveralls. The truck still rattled at idle. Eli and Mason, both in their 20s, watched their father choose strain over leverage and began asking a serious question at the kitchen table after supper. Why not scale like everyone else? Clayton did not answer with a speech. He opened the ledger, turned it toward them, and tapped the one column he trusted most when markets turned ugly. Amount owed, 0. Eli read the line twice, then leaned back and crossed his arms as if the number might change if he gave it room. Mason kept looking at the page and then at his father's hands, grease still caught in the cuticles from the Steiger repair. Clayton did not fill the silence. He let arithmetic do the work. On the right side of the ledger, he had written the dealer option in pencil, $2,236 per month for 120 months. Total payments, $268,320, before one filter, one tire, one hose, one insurance premium. Under that, he wrote his own path in pen, purchased $9,800, repairs $7,420, outside welding $520, first year total $17,740. Then he drew one line and wrote the only comparison he believed mattered in bad years. Fixed obligation. Next month. Dealer plan $2,236. Paid for plan $0. Mason finally said what both sons had been circling. You are trading speed for survival. Clayton nodded once. Survival first, then options. 3 days later, rain broke and the window opened. Clayton planted corn until midnight for 6 straight nights, then switched to soybeans with only 1 day lost to a hydraulic leak on the planter fold cylinder that cost $146 in parts and 4 hours in the shed. By May 4th, all 620 acres were in. Extension estimates had warned of an 11-bushel corn penalty if he slipped past the window. He slipped only enough to project a 2-bushel drag on 110 acres. At $2.38 cash corn, that meant an estimated gross hit of $523.60, not $16,231. The Steiger, called scrap in March, had protected roughly $15,707 in top-line revenue by simple timeliness. That summer, he kept weekend ripping jobs he had promised, 412 custom acres at $18 per acre for $7,416 gross, with $2,940 in fuel and wear, netting $4,476. He directed every dollar into operating liquidity. When fertilizer prepay came due, the $41,760 check cleared without a line of credit. Brent called twice in June and once in August. Clayton returned one call, thanked him for checking in, and bought nothing. Harvest finished with corn at 164 bushels average and soybeans at 47. Gross crop revenue for 2003 landed at $198,940. After rent, inputs, fuel, crop insurance, repairs, and family living, net cash increase was $31,280. Eli had expected less. Mason had expected none. Clayton handed each son a copy of the year-end sheet and circled one figure in red. Working capital at year close, $112,400. He did not claim victory out loud. He just set the year-end page on the kitchen table beside the repair receipts and prepay check stub, then turned to the next ledger because the next decade would test whether the same discipline could hold when conditions changed. The proving started in plain sight and mostly went unnoticed. In January 2004, Clayton took Eli to a small farm auction near Beeman. The crowd formed around newer paint and higher horsepower, while Clayton stood by a weathered 12-row cultivator with worn sweeps and one bent wing-wheel arm. Hammer price was $1,050. Steel bolts and 2 Saturday afternoons turned it field-ready for another $620. A similar new unit listed at $18,900. Clayton did not celebrate the difference. He simply entered both numbers in his notebook and wrote, "Function bought at 8.8 cents on the dollar." By the second week of February, Mason joined him to service the Steiger in ritual order: oils first, filters second, articulation pins last, then cab seals and wiring before field season. Parts and fluids were $1,184 that year. A dealership annual service contract for comparable horsepower quoted $6,400. Clayton never used this as a morality tale. He framed it as control. "If we can diagnose it, we can schedule it," he said. "If we finance uptime, someone else controls our week." Then came the ledger run that would define the family argument for a decade. 2004. Gross crop revenue, $214,600. Net saved $38,900. Operating debt open, $0. 2005. Added 60 rented acres at $128 per acre, cash rent. Gross $236,400. Net saved $41,200. 2006. Purchased 80 acres in Blackhawk County for $48,000 cash after 18 months of staged reserves. Closing costs and fees $3,840. Property tax annualized $2,460. 2007. Installed grain bin fan and unload upgrades for $9,700 cash, reducing moisture discounts by $6,180 in one season. 2008. Corn dropped to $3.12, and soybean basis widened sharply. Gross fell to $201,300. Net still positive at $17,600 because no term payments existed. 2009. Rebuilt planter meters and drive chains for $2,280 instead of trading. Yield gains estimated at 4.2 bushels corn on 420 acres. 2010. Drainage project on chronic wet ground. 34 acres tiled for $42,300 cash. 2011. Drier spring and improved stands on tiled ground added estimated 18 bushels per acre on those acres at $6.02 corn. 2012. Drought year. Corn yield down to 121 bushels average. Soybeans 34. No restructuring meeting. No covenant breach. No forced liquidation. 2013. Recovered yields, rebuilt cash reserves, Year-end working capital crossed $420 per acre under operation. The sequence looked conservative at coffee tables. It looked compounding on paper. Not everyone around Clayton was reckless, and that matters for truth. Ron Becker had a reputation for immaculate rows and honest dealing. He financed expansion in 2007 when land bids accelerated, carrying $1.26 million in notes, much of it variable at 8.4% by reset periods. His annual debt service moved above $141,000 before family living. 2 weak years and one machinery repair cycle later, he could not hold 400 acres that had been in his family line for decades. The auction was orderly and painful. Clayton attended, bought nothing, and helped haul boxed records to Ron's pickup afterward. Teresa Lund ran her acres with precision and worked harder than most men who advised her. In 2011, she signed a $312,000 combine note and carried a $190,000 operating line against expected yield and stronger forward prices. Then basis widened, fuel rose, and a wet harvest forced drying costs she had not budgeted for. She filed Chapter 12 protection, sold rented ground first, then machinery in tranches. She kept 90 owned acres and a farmhouse, but her model had no room for timing shocks. Miguel Herrera built a mixed crop and cattle operation that once looked like the local template for smart growth. In 2009 and 2010, he refinanced machinery with land into total obligations near $890,000 at blended interest just above 7.1%. After 2 weak harvests, feed costs climbed while cattle margins compressed, and debt service consumed flexibility. He sold his herd to stop the bleed and shifted to custom work to keep the home place. Clayton never used Miguel as cautionary theater. He called him a good operator caught by sequence risk. These were not morality plays. They were arithmetic under pressure. Each winter, Brent Halverson returned with a new packet and the same confidence. In 2009, he pushed a pre-owned articulated model at $124,000, 5 years at 5.8%. Monthly payment $2,384. In 2011, he offered end-of-year incentives, claiming accelerated write-offs would pay for half. In 2013, he came with a full replacement cycle proposal, tractor, planter, and tillage package, totaling $412,700, with blended financing at 4.9%. Annual payment just under $53,000. Clayton read every page, asked for maintenance assumptions, fuel curves, and depreciation schedules, then handed the folder back. He never mocked Brent. He simply would not sign. By the first week of December 2013, the family tension finally surfaced in a way that could not be postponed. Eli and Mason, now seasoned enough to run full days alone, asked why they were still operating like a low-capital outfit when neighbors with newer fleets were covering more ground in fewer passes. It was a fair question. They were not asking for status. They were asking about future scale, workload, and whether discipline had turned into hesitation. Clayton answered by changing the form of the conversation. He called County Extension, requested a machinery cost comparison model, and spent 3 evenings entering 10 years of their own records instead of benchmark averages. Fuel logs, repair receipts, delay days, acres covered per weather window, interest scenarios at 4.5, 6.0, and 7.5%. Forced replacement intervals, insurance deltas, resale assumptions deliberately conservative. Eli thought it would prove they were close either way. Mason expected a modest advantage, maybe $20 an acre. Neither expected what came back. The spreadsheet showed the old Steiger and paid-for machinery structure had preserved an average of $71 per acre each year compared to financed replacement pathways. Once interest, depreciation, mandatory turnover timing, and insurance were included. Across their operating base and the measured period, the cumulative advantage calculated to $512,740. Clayton printed the report, laid it beside his handwritten ledgers, and said only one sentence. This is what patience looks like when you add it. At the Jordan table, the argument turned on that single per acre figure. They ran it forward, backward, and against every assumption they could challenge, and the number held without needing a speech to prop it up. On a windless January evening in 2014, the three men sat at the same table where Denise had once balanced household envelopes. Clayton slid 2 typed pages to his sons. The document was not a will and not a gift. It was a framework. Each son would receive operating authority over a half unit of the farm, but only under 2 conditions measured annually. Working capital must remain above $350 per acre, and equipment debt must remain 0 for 5 consecutive seasons. Land would stay centrally held until both conditions were demonstrated through a full cycle that included at least 1 down market year. Eli read it and said, "So inheritance is earned on cash discipline." Clayton said, "Control follows proof." Mason asked whether this meant no growth. Clayton shook his head. "Growth, yes. Fragility, no." They both signed. Not because the life looked easier. It did not. The truck outside still had rust eating the rocker panels. The same stubborn door still needed the same awkward push from the inside. The coveralls still had patches. From the road, nothing looked transformed. But from the ledger forward, the farm had shifted from one man's instinct to a documented operating system that could be tested, taught, and eventually transferred without a bank writing the family's terms for them. That spring, Brent drove past the Jordan place in a new pickup with dealer plates and paused long enough to watch the old Steiger pull through black ground in an even, unhurried line. He did not stop. He still believed time would force a signature. Clayton believed time would expose total cost. One of them was about to be measured in public by numbers neither could negotiate. Measured in public started first with a private season of proof. Clayton put Eli on the west half and Mason on the east half for spring field work. Not as symbolism, but as accounting structure, each with separate fuel logs, repair tickets, and per-acre margin sheets that rolled into one master ledger on Sunday nights. He did not relax the conditions by $1. Working capital stayed above $350 per acre, or authority narrowed the next year. Equipment debt stayed at 0, or decision rights reverted to him. By June 2014, both sons understood that the framework was less about restriction than calibration. They could make nearly any agronomic choice they could defend, but they could not buy speed with borrowed fragility. Harvest 2014 gave them the first clean test. Corn averaged 189 bushels on 452 corn acres, sold at an average cash price of $3.61 after basis. Soybeans averaged 54 bushels on 168 acres at $10.18. Gross crop revenue reached $1,348. Total operating cost, including cash rent, seed, fertilizer, chemical, fuel, drying, crop insurance, and repairs, was $193,404. Family living and payroll to both sons added $20,908. Net cash added to reserves, $187,036. Year-end working capital measured $404,786. equal to $653 per acre. The covenant held, and Clayton signed the next year's authority memo with the same blue pen Denise had used for household checks. Before they went any further, he asked them to do one habit every month: write down the financed alternative beside the paid-for path. In 2015, they bought a used 12-row planter with precision row shutoffs for $18,600 cash, then put $3,240 into meters and harnesses. Brent's equivalent package that winter was $92,400 with 5-year financing at 5.6%. Annual payment $21,367. Their version cost $21,840 total, and no required payment after purchase. Yield response on overlap control and singulation raised corn estimates by 3.1 bushels on 460 acres. At $3.74, that was $5,333 in gross gain in one season, while depreciation stayed shallow because purchase basis was already low. By the third week of October 2015, a 40-acre parcel touching their east line came to market at $7,800 per acre. Total price was $312,000 plus $6,940 closing costs and survey adjustments. Clayton made the sons run 3 scenarios at the kitchen table: finance 70% at 4.8% for 20 years, finance 50% at 4.8%, or pay cash and replenish reserves through grain carry and disciplined draws. They chose cash. The check reduced liquidity hard in the short term, dropping year-end cash equivalents to $201,500, but the land immediately removed annual rent exposure of $9,200 and added a tangible asset whose assessed and market values were diverging upward. Eli wrote the note in the margin himself: rent risk converted to ownership certainty. The open question was whether that conservative math would hold when markets turned again. The next 6 years were not gentle, and the stress tested every claim. 2016 widened the operating footprint to 780 acres when they added a 120-acre lease at $255 per acre from a retiring neighbor who valued timeliness over headline rent. Corn prices softened, but basis at 2 local elevators improved enough that split delivery added margin. Gross revenue came in at $301,840. Net saved was $64,920 after a $28,000 reserve transfer earmarked for tile and grain handling. In 2017, they executed that plan: $56,700 cash for additional tile, culvert correction, and 1 used hopper bottom trailer purchased for $14,500 instead of a new trailer, quoted at $41,200. Yield variability tightened across the wettest 80 acres. An average field loss from drown-out dropped from 6.8% to 2.1% over 2 seasons. Clayton insisted on a second ledger, one that looked boring enough to be ignored and powerful enough to change a family's trajectory: household and operator living. In 2017, his annual personal draw remained $34,200. Eli drew $39,000. Mason drew $39,000. Combined family living and health insurance costs were $122,400, fully paid, no consumer debt carried. They replaced nothing for appearance. The 1994 Chevrolet stayed in service with 347,000 miles after a rebuilt transfer case for $1,460 and front brake work at $420. On paper, those decisions looked small. Over 10 years, they were compounding levers. By January 2018, Brent's winter packet changed tone. Instead of arguing status, he argued labor efficiency and downtime risk. The proposed package was a tractor and vertical tillage, set totaling $438,900, 7 years at 4.9%, annual payment $74,572. Eli asked for one night to think. Mason asked for fuel assumptions and trade-in floors. Clayton handed them the 2014 extension model and said nothing for a full minute. They declined the package at breakfast the next day. Brent stayed polite, but his confidence had a thinner edge now, because he could no longer frame the Jordans as uninformed. The contrast with peers sharpened in those same years, and Clayton never treated it as vindication theater. Ron Becker leased back 160 acres after losing 400, ran a smaller operation, and took seasonal agronomy scouting work at $24 per hour to stabilize income. His restructured obligations still required $38,600 annually through 20 to 21, and he met every payment, though it cost him scale and sleep. Teresa Lunn exited Chapter 12 with her farmhouse and 90 acres intact, then rebuilt deliberately by custom harvesting and bookkeeping for 2 neighboring farms in winter. She paid cash for a used header at $19,800 in 2018 and a grain cart at $8,400 in 2019, avoiding new notes entirely after learning what one tight sequence can do to a balance sheet. Miguel Herrera, after selling his herd, moved to crops and trucking, reducing fixed exposure. By 2020, he had trimmed remaining debt principal below $240,000, still heavy but manageable because he refused fresh machinery loans even when dealers offered low teaser rates. Around the county, people read those choices differently. Some saw older iron and rejected credit as caution bordering on fear, while Clayton saw long memory at work, the kind that understood how quickly fixed payments could turn a weather event into a family crisis. The crisis came in layered form, the way farm crises usually do. 2019 opened with saturated fields and delayed planting windows across the county line. Then nitrogen, phosphate, and potash moved higher over 2 purchasing cycles, with the Jordan blend cost rising from $118 per acre in 2020 to $174 per acre by 2022. Diesel averaged $2.41 per gallon in 2020 and climbed above $4.60 in key 2022 windows. Meanwhile, interest rates that had been treated as background assumptions moved sharply, and variable operating lines many neighbors carried reset from the low 4% range toward 8 and 9%. Operators who had structured growth around thin margins and low money cost discovered that sequence risk had returned. The arithmetic was blunt. A neighbor carrying a $600,000 operating line at 4.25% paid $25,500 annual interest before principal reduction. At 8.75%, that same line demanded $52,500. The extra $27,000 had to come from somewhere: deferred maintenance, unpaid family labor, delayed rent, or asset sale. Add a machinery note of $68,000 annual payment and a weak basis year, and working capital could evaporate in one cycle. Brent's own customer base felt it. He had moved volume for years on monthly payment psychology, and now some buyers were calling his office asking whether maturities could be stretched again. On the Jordan side, the same shocks hurt but did not corner them. They prepaid portions of fertilizer when basis and freight lined up, used on-farm storage to avoid panic sales, and trimmed non-critical passes to save fuel. They never missed an input invoice, never requested an emergency extension, never pledged land for machinery. In 2020, gross revenue was $412,300 with a strong soybean pricing. Net added to reserves after all costs was $146,200. In 2021, gross reached $498,600. Net added $211,900. In 2022, despite elevated input costs, disciplined marketing and strong corn yields produced $545,400 gross and $238,700 net. By December 2022, Jordan Family Farms, LLC held $2,934,000 in cash equivalents, $1,126,000 in grain inventory at conservative valuation, and owned land carried at historical cost far below market. The internal net worth statement, prepared with outside accounting review, crossed $7,800,000 before the next year's land revaluation cycle. The sons hit their 5-year covenant cleanly. Working capital never fell below $382 per acre in any year. Equipment debt remained zero for all 5 seasons and then 2 more. Clayton executed the next document exactly as promised. Expanded operating control to debt-free partners with capital decisions requiring unanimous signatures above $75,000. He did not give a speech when they signed. He checked each number, then asked Mason to put the papers in the fireproof box under the ledger drawer. By the first week of January 2023, stress in the broader market turned visible at the courthouse bulletin board in Marshall County. A 640-acre contiguous tract entered lender action after a failed refinance, and the posted opening figure reflected how expensive leveraged timing had become. Brent read the notice the morning it went up. Clayton read it that afternoon, then folded a legal pad sheet with 12 lines of arithmetic and drove home in the same rusted Chevrolet, the odometer now at 389,000 miles, one door still opening from the outside. Within 10 days, he had liquidated a planned ladder of cash equivalents, priced grain for delivery windows that preserved basis, and prepared proof of funds letters without one lender contingency. The public measurement he and Brent had both predicted was no longer theoretical. It was scheduled. The sale notice listed Thursday at 10 o'clock in the Marshall County Courthouse corridor, and by 9:20 the hallway already held lenders, 2 auction clerks, 3 neighboring operators, and Brent Halverson in a pressed charcoal coat, with a folder thick enough to suggest prepared financing contingencies. Clayton Jordan arrived 7 minutes later, parked the 1994 Chevrolet K2500 beside newer pickups, and stepped out in the same patched brown coveralls, now faded almost tan at the thighs, with the odometer reading 389,214 miles. The driver door still needed that awkward inside push. From 10 feet away, he looked like the least liquid man in the building. He checked in with the clerk, handed over the bidder registration packet, and set a bank envelope on the counter as if it contained ordinary closing papers. Brent watched him sign, then leaned toward one of the men from a regional lender and said, quietly, but not quietly enough, "He is here to test the room." It was the same assumption that had followed Clayton for 20 years. Modest clothes meant constrained options. Old truck meant no scale. Caution meant fear. At 10:03, the clerk opened the process, stated the tract details, and confirmed terms. 640 contiguous acres, as is, immediate earnest certification, closing in 30 minutes with verified funds, no financing delays accepted. The opening number drew two small bumps from parties tied to credit approvals, then stalled when proof of funds timing tightened. Clayton raised once and did not look around. Another bidder lifted by $20,000, then stopped when the clerk requested immediate confirmation language from counsel. Clayton raised again and held. At 10:29, the hammer came down at $4,480,000. The hallway went flat for a second, the way crowded rooms do when expectations break in public. Clayton opened the bank envelope and placed a cashier check on the clerk's table for the full amount, issued to the sale officer from a Jordan Family Farms LLC reserve account that had been pre-cleared that morning. No lender term sheet, no post-award call, no collateral rider. Cash equivalent, converted to instrument, title path clean. Brent stared at the check, then asked the clerk if he could verify issuing funds before final acknowledgement. The clerk said verification was procedural and invited him to stand there if he wished. Brent called the issuing bank from his own phone, identified himself, read the check number, and listened while three witnesses stood within earshot. He thanked the officer, ended the call, and did not move for several seconds. Then he said the sentence that resolved 2 decades of sales theater without drama or bitterness. I sold payments for 20 years, and you sold patience. Clayton nodded once, signed the close sheet, and asked where to initial the transfer affidavit. What mattered after the hallway was not the spectacle of a cash close, but the arithmetic that made it possible. One paid-for machine, then one covenant, then one governance structure held long enough to become transferable authority. 35 minutes after the hammer, Clayton and his attorney crossed into the recorder office with a second packet already prepared. The first filing placed the newly acquired tract into the family land trust. The second amended operating control. Eli and Mason received immediate operating authority over 1,420 total acres, including the new tract under leaseback terms from the trust, with voting rights on crop plans, input procurement, and marketing windows. One clause sat at the center in plain language. Trust assets could not be pledged above 15% loan-to-value under any circumstance, and equipment debt remained prohibited. If they wanted expansion, they would expand by retained earnings, not by monthly promises. Eli signed and exhaled at the same time, as if he had been holding a breath for 5 years. Mason reread the leverage clause, looked at Clayton, and said, "So even success cannot tempt us into fragility." Clayton answered with 5 words. "That is the point, exactly." 3 days later, after title confirmation cleared, he walked into the machine shed, laid one hand on the Steiger's left rear fender, and handed the original 1978 title and restoration ledger to his sons. Purchase $9,800. First resurrection cycle, $7,420 plus labor. Major service entries across 20 years itemized to the dollar. Total lifetime machinery outlay, including all major overhauls, remained below what one financed replacement cycle would have demanded in mandatory payments alone. The tractor once called scrap was now legally and operationally theirs, debt-free, attached to a farm structure that could withstand weather and rates because it did not owe monthly tribute to either. By mid-May 2023, Clayton shifted from transfer to multiplication. He met Teresa Lund, Miguel Herrera, and Ron Becker separately, not to offer rescue theater, but to offer structured footing designed to keep them out of the same traps that had already hurt them. He did not frame it as charity. He framed it as terms that favored durability. He seeded the Jordan Grounded Start Fund with $1,200,000 in cash equivalents, held under a simple mandate: zero interest or near zero interest productive assets only, with covenant rules tied to working capital and leverage discipline, and one reciprocal condition for each recipient. When their operations stabilized, they had to mentor or materially assist the next operator. Teresa's package came first. She needed dependable harvesting capacity and planting precision without reopening high payment exposure. The fund purchased a used combine, header, and grain cart package for $168,400, then leased it to her through a lease-to-own structure valued at $140,000 over 7 years at zero interest after a $28,400 grant-equivalent down adjustment. Annual payment, $20,000, due after harvest with one optional deferment year if countywide yield dropped below trigger levels. She expanded from 90 acres to 310 acres through staged rental agreements because she could now demonstrate equipment reliability and cash discipline to landlords. In 2024, her net operating margin after all costs and her own draw reached $86,300. In 2025, with tighter basis management and improved soybean yields, it rose to $102,700. She did not become flashy. She became stable. Miguel's structure differed because Cattle Restart required liquidity timing and feed risk control. The fund extended a $95,000 restart note at zero interest for 48 months, with quarterly principal targets and one weather contingency clause tied to feed cost spikes above defined thresholds. He used $61,200 for bred heifers, $18,700 for hay and feed buffer, $9,800 for water and fence rehabilitation, and held the balance for veterinary and transport costs. His payments ran $5,937.50 per quarter. He hit each one. By year 4, the note was repaid in full, and his crop trucking cattle blend generated enough free cash flow to rebuild reserves above $140,000 without adding machinery debt. Ron Becker did not ask for himself. He asked whether his daughter Claire could ever bring part of the family landline back under their name without betting her future on a full commercial mortgage. Clayton reviewed her books, verified her tenancy performance, and offered a seller-financed path on 120 acres from trust inventory at $210,000, 1% interest, 15-year amortization with no prepayment penalty. The monthly payment was $1,257.42. Annual debt service, $15,089. Claire's projected net from that tract under conservative yields covered it with room, and by making principal curtailments after 2 strong seasons, she cut effective term length by nearly 3 years. Ron cried once quietly in the pickup after closing, then went back to work the next morning. The terms looked strict on paper, yet the design was deliberately humane. Each obligation was sized to survive stress-priced years, and each package was built to keep families operating with decision control still in their own hands. By the first week of November 2024, the fund had approved 12 operators total across Marshall, Grundy, and neighboring counties. Not one package exceeded what the recipient could service under stress-priced assumptions. Not one package allowed open-ended machinery leverage. Several were small and practical. A $42,000 grain handling retrofit for a young tenant couple. Paid over 6 years at zero interest, a $68,500 shop and service line for a widowed operator to stop paying high emergency repair call rates. A $31,800 drainage correction on rented ground where landlord and tenant shared terms because the fund required both signatures. Small numbers by some standards, life-changing in sequence. The deeper examination came from ledger discipline, not from sentiment, and Clayton required annual third-party review, so no one could call the results anecdotal. In January 2025, the accountant prepared a side-by-side analysis covering 2003 through 2024 under two modeled paths: financed replacement cycles at prevailing rates and the Jordan paid-for strategy with staged cash purchases and repair-heavy maintenance. On machinery and related carrying costs alone, the paid-for path preserved $1,184,600 cumulative cash flow after accounting for higher repair years. Unavoided interest across equipment and operating carry, preserved cash totaled $742,300. Uncontrolled living draws and reinvestment timing, additional retained capital reached $516,900. Aggregate preserved and redeployed capital, $2,443,800 before land appreciation effects. Then land effects were layered in. The 80 acres bought in 2006 for $148,000 and the 40 acres bought in 2015 for $312,000 were both carried at cost on internal conservative statements, but market comparables by late 2025 placed those tracks far higher. The 640-acre acquisition at $4,480,000 in 2023 looked aggressive at purchase, yet because it carried no financing drag, the operating entity could absorb variable years without covenant pressure, while the trust held appreciating real assets. When the accountants consolidated land at conservative market benchmarks, grain inventory, cash equivalents, and operating equipment, the verified family net worth by spring 2026 stood at $11,940,000. The key tension never changed. People had read appearance and missed structure. The patched coveralls were real. The rust on the truck was real. The wealth was also real. But it had been built where outsiders were not looking, in avoided interest, in preserved optionality, in not being forced to sell in weak windows, and in using each no-payment year to buy one more year of independence. By March of 2026, the fund's first cohort outcomes were formalized. Teresa remained current and ahead on her lease-to-own schedule, with 2 years effectively shaved off by supplemental principal payments. Miguel had repaid in full and then contributed $12,000 back into the fund as voluntary recycling capital. Claire had completed year 3 on her contract, principal reduced faster than schedule, and at least an adjacent 40 acres with no additional term debt. Across all 12 assisted operators, stabilized acreage reached 3,860 acres with estimated aggregate asset value of $27,300,000, and the weighted average debt service ratio sat well below county stress levels because most assistants had replaced high-cost obligations rather than adding fresh ones. Brent's resolution arrived without announcement. In late 2025, he closed the high-pressure new sales arm that had lived on monthly payment framing and opened a used equipment rebuild division with transparent total ownership cost sheets attached to every listing. Younger sales staff were trained to show 3 columns, not one: purchase price, annual carrying cost, and downside year survivability. He still sold new equipment when it penciled out. He just stopped pretending payment size was the whole equation. When asked why he changed, he gave a dry answer. I watched a man in patched coveralls close faster than my financing office. By then, around Marshall County, the lesson had traveled farther than the original sale day. Growth financed by discipline could outlast growth financed by optimism, especially when weather and pricing windows turned against fixed obligations. On an April evening, with planting a week out, Clayton parked the same truck beside the machine shed, now at 400 and 1,003 miles, shut it off, and listened to Eli and Mason review seed placement maps at the workbench. The Steigers sat, washed, serviced, and ready, title clear in the son's operating file. No speech, no banner. Just ledgers in a drawer, clauses that protected land from leverage drift, and a county full of people who had watched the poorest-looking rig in town carry the strongest balance sheet when it counted. Clayton did not interrupt them. He listened to Eli explain variable rate seeding on the lighter ridgetops, and Mason explain why they were holding a little more dry powder for side dress timing. Then he set a legal pad on the bench and wrote 3 names in block letters: Teresa, Miguel, Claire. Under each name he wrote 1 line item for the next fund review meeting, because his idea of legacy was never abstract. It was payment history, repair logs, crop plans, and whether a family still had choices in August when markets turned mean. In the 3rd week of April 2026, the Jordan Grounded Start Fund Committee met at the co-op conference room with coffee in foam cups and county plat books open along one wall. Teresa Lund brought updated books showing 310 acres operated, gross revenue of $612,400 for 2025, and net operating income of $102,700 after labor, rent, fuel, and repairs. She had made 7 scheduled payments on the lease-to-own package and 2 extra principal curtailments, totaling $18,000. Her remaining balance on the zero-interest structure stood at $62,000, and she had moved her working capital from $118 per acre at program entry to $396 per acre. She asked for nothing that day. She offered to mentor 2 younger tenants who were still trapped in high-cost custom harvest contracts. Miguel Herrera came in after her with a binder so organized that the accountant smiled before opening it. His $95,000 restart note was fully retired, and his blended operation had matured into a durable, 3-legged model. 190 acres of row crop, a right-sized cattle unit at 84 head, and winter trucking with a paid-for tandem he had rebuilt rather than replaced. His 2025 free cash flow after family living and taxes was $71,300. He had set aside $12,000 as voluntary recycling capital to the fund and another $9,500 for fence and waterline upgrades he planned to pay in cash. He told Eli quietly, "No lender calls at midnight now." That single sentence captured more than any spreadsheet could. Claire Becker presented last with Ron sitting beside her and saying almost nothing. Her 120-acre seller finance contract had started at $210,000 at 1%, 15-year amortization, monthly payment $1,257.42. She had made every payment on time, then added 2 year-end principal reductions of $11,000 and $14,000 after strong corn and disciplined grain storage. In her updated schedule, principal had fallen to $161,800, roughly $28,000 ahead of schedule. She had leased an adjacent 40 acres on a 3-year term, with flexible rent tied partly to actual yield, not only posted averages. Ron, who once watched 400 acres leave the family line, now spent mornings calibrating her planter monitor and afternoons scouting for gray leaf spot like he had never left full-time farming. The committee did not adjourn when the 3 core files were done. Clayton turned the legal pad, and Eli pulled the second stack forward. Tyler and Jenna Voss, Naomi Reed, Devin Cho. The room shifted from testimony to mechanics. Tyler and Jenna's $42,000 grain handling retrofit had cut their harvest bottleneck enough to capture basis improvements averaging 18 cents per bushel on 96,000 bushels, marketed in tranches, a gross lift of $17,280 before storage costs. Naomi's $68,500 shop service package had reduced emergency repair invoices by $21,400 in one season, and she had converted the savings into pre-bought fertilizer under better terms. Devon's $31,800 drainage correction, done with landlord cosign and strict reporting, had produced 2 seasons without prevented planting claims on that tract. On paper, the pattern looked simple. In person, it looked like fewer panic calls and cleaner settlement sheets. Clayton circled one phrase in his notes and read it aloud so there was no soft interpretation. Generosity without structure fails both giver and receiver. Then he had Mason read the fund ledger line by line. The starting capitalization remained $1,200,000 cash equivalents. Repayments, modest service fees on 2 near-zero interest contracts, and recycled capital contributions from successful recipients were all tagged separately, so nobody could inflate results with loose language. Active support touched 12 operators. Stabilized acreage was 3,860. The weighted productivity trend had moved in the right direction as recipients timed inputs and repairs instead of reacting to cash emergencies. Conservative local marks still placed the associated asset base near $27,300,000. The numbers were not presented as a victory lap. They were treated as an operating control panel that had to stay honest. Brent Halverson stood near the back through that section, one hand on the chair rail, listening as an outsider who already knew he was no longer outside the same problem. When the meeting broke for 10 minutes, he asked Clayton if he could stay for the vendor standards discussion. Clayton nodded and slid him a packet. Brent opened it and found the comparison format Eli and Mason required for any major machinery proposal: purchase price, expected annual repair, fuel profile, downside year cash demand, and 3-year survivability under weak basis assumptions. He did not argue with the template. He asked for a digital copy. That afternoon, Brent drove straight back to his lot and called his sales manager and service lead into the small glass office that still had new unit posters on the wall. Commission plans had rewarded finance volume for years. He put a red line through the old bonus metric and replaced it with documented total ownership cost comparisons and customer 3-year survivability outcomes. The first response was silence. The second was pushback about thinner margins. Brent answered by hiring 2 technicians from a shuttered independent shop and authorizing a larger reman inventory so repair predictions could be real rather than sales talk. He still kept new inventory for operations that could carry it. He stopped pushing packages that required perfect weather and perfect basis to stay current. Rain moved across the county in short pulses through planting, and the Jordans held their weekly merge exactly as written in the governance framework. West half log, east half log, then a single master ledger with covenant checks. Eli and Mason argued over forward contract percentages one Tuesday night until Mason put down his pen and asked for the downside case instead of the optimistic case. That ended the argument in arithmetic, which had always been the point. Equipment debt stayed at 0. Authority stayed with the sons under the trust clauses, and any capital decision above the unanimous signatures threshold paused until both signed. Clayton sat in on the review without taking the chair. He asked questions, then kept quiet. At a county equipment meeting, a cluster of younger sales reps cornered Brent near the coffee urn and asked why he was putting cost-risk sheets in front of customers who only wanted monthly payment numbers. Brent looked at them for a long second and gave the line he had learned the hard way. If the machine only works at optimistic prices, you did not sell iron, you sold hope on credit. No one clapped. They wrote it down. The fund office stayed busy without getting loud. Ron drew a modest consulting check from 2 neighboring farms and spent Fridays helping Claire with books. Teresa hired 1 full-time employee and paid him year-round so she could stop burning out during harvest peaks. Miguel's oldest son returned to the operation after trade school, and they bought a used feed mixer for $8,900 cash from Brent's rebuild lot, then logged every maintenance hour the way Clayton had taught everyone around him. Naomi Reed pushed her remaining package balance below $22,000 and opened a separate emergency reserve account she called Sleep Money. Tyler and Jenna Voss renewed their lease and negotiated a better term after landlords saw 3 straight years of timely field work and clean settlements. Harold Pike's name, which had started Clayton's long memory back in 1985, came up one evening at the edge of the parking lot after another review session. Claire mentioned she still planned the December ham drop for Elaine Pike with a handwritten note on fund outcomes, because old losses made better instruction when they were named plainly instead of buried. Clayton did not respond right away. He looked past the grain legs toward home and said only that shame had bankrupted enough families already. Facts could do better work than pride. On a clear evening, Clayton closed the shed doors after servicing the Steiger with Eli and Mason, each step still done in the same order: oils, filters, pins, seals, wiring. The tractor carried new hoses, a rebuilt alternator, and paint touch-ups on the hood edges, but the frame still showed its age and history honestly. He did not romanticize old iron. He respected paid-for capability. The 1994 Chevrolet sat outside with 6,882 miles, rust unchanged, engine dependable. Inside the office, the county audit packet lay open beside the trust minutes. 12 operators active, 0 charge-offs, 2 packages paid in full ahead of schedule. Weighted leverage across recipients, below county average by a wide margin. Acres stabilized, families still in control, no one forced into panic liquidation because a lender committee changed tone in a weak month. Denise Jordan's blue pen stayed in the kitchen drawer, refilled twice, still used to sign the annual trust minutes. Near sunset, Clayton stood at the machine shed threshold while Eli and Mason reviewed next week's planning sequence under a single hanging light. The washed Steiger rested inside, title clear. The ledgers sat in their drawer. The trust clauses held. The truck outside looked poor. The balance sheet did not. The next Tuesday, with a light rain ticking on the co-op windows, Clayton opened the fund ledger to the page marked June 20 to 26 and asked Teresa to go first. She set down 3 folders and 1 cashier receipt, then slid a handwritten mentoring schedule across the table. The receipt showed an extra principal payment of $9,000 on top of her required $20,000 annual lease-to-own payment, cutting her remaining balance from $62,000 to $53,000 in one move. The mentoring schedule named Naomi Reed and Devin Cho for 12 joint field days, each day tied to one decision point: pre-harvest moisture strategy, repair triage, landlord reporting, and post-harvest cash allocation. Teresa kept her voice steady and short. I was helped with structure. I am passing structure forward. Before anyone stood for coffee, Naomi had adopted Teresa's deferred draw method and moved her emergency reserve from $22,000 to $31,400 without adding debt, while Devin had adjusted input timing and penciled a $6,780 reduction in in-season carry costs before the first application pass. Miguel came in wearing a clean work shirt still creased from folding, dropped a check for $15,000 into the recycling capital line, and handed Mason a one-page summary showing why his operation now held through weak months. Row crop net contribution for 2025 was $38,900. Cattle net was $24,600. Winter trucking net was $17,800. Combined free cash flow after family living and taxes was $71,300, and he had held $52,000 of that in cash equivalents rather than replacing equipment early. He had bought only one additional asset, a used hay merger from Brent's rebuild division for $6,400 cash, because it cut hired custom costs by $3,100 per season. Miguel looked toward Claire across the table and said, "Debt used to decide my timing. Now timing decides my debt, which is none." Claire Becker waited until Ron nodded, then opened her amortization sheet. Original principal was $210,000 at 1%, 15 years. Scheduled principal by that point should have been $174,900. Actual principal stood at $161,800 after disciplined curtailments, with monthly payments still at $1,257.42, and no prepayment penalty touched except by choice. She had also signed a purchase option on the adjacent 40 acres she had leased, with a planned cash down payment of $38,000 and a seller-financed remainder capped at 1.5%. Ron did not speak until Clayton asked if he wanted to add anything. He cleared his throat and gave one sentence. "I watched land leave once, and I watched my daughter bring it back with math." Then he folded his hands and stared at the table until the meeting moved on. Without adjourning, Mason pulled a large sheet from the next tab in the binder and fixed it to the wall map with two black clips. The heading read, "Cohort Stability Review," and the numbers sat in thick marker so nobody had to squint. 12 assisted operators were active. 2 had fully repaid and become contributors. None had missed a scheduled payment. Stabilized acreage remained 3,860, but the weighted average working capital had risen from $162 per acre at entry to $347 per acre across the group. The accountant ran stress prices across the sheet and marked the result at the bottom. With a 20% commodity drop, the cohort still stayed cash flow positive before family living on 10 of 12 operations. Clayton read each line once, asked for one recalculation on fuel assumptions, watched the same result print, signed the review with Denise's blue pen, and put the signed minutes into the fireproof box under the same drawer that held the original covenant pages. The next packet in sequence was Brent's operating model report. Instead of a speech, he laid out copies of the exact sales board and compensation sheets his team now used at county equipment meetings and shop reviews. 3 required lines appeared on every quote: total purchase basis, annual carrying cost under realistic repairs, and downside year survivability at weak basis and higher fuel. He had closed the old incentive model that paid highest on finance volume and replaced it with a blended metric tied to customer retention, service quality, and documented 3-year outcome. Commissions dropped in the first quarter. Service revenue climbed. Delinquencies among his buyers fell. Used rebuild orders rose enough that he added 2 more technicians before winter. When one rep had asked why they were making selling harder, Brent's answer was printed in the margin from his own notes, plain as a torque spec. Hard now or disastrous later. Pick one. He still sold new machines when the book supported it. He stopped selling optimism as a substitute for arithmetic. After lunch, the room changed from fun committee to family trust session without anyone saying the words out loud. They carried the binders to the kitchen table where Denise used to stack envelopes by week and opened the archive tab stamped Annual Review. The original green notebook from 2003 sat beside the printed audit pages, and each line item that once looked small had a visible descendant. The $7,420 Steiger Resurrection sat at the start of a chain that now protected 1,420 family-operated acres under a leveraged ceiling that had never been breached. The copy of the 2023 cashier check for $4,480,000 remained clipped to the courthouse close sheet in the archive folder, marked verified and recorded. The old legal pad pages from the bench meeting had been scanned, indexed, and filed under fund governance. Even the odd details stayed honest in the record. Truck mileage at each major decision point, door latch still external release only, and annual repair totals entered without rounding. They went down the roll call the way they always did, with no speeches and no skipped names. Clayton, age 81, still lived in the same farmhouse and still drew a modest annual personal amount. Eli managed West Unit crop planning and grain marketing windows, remained debt-free, and had not missed a covenant threshold once. Mason managed East Unit operations, maintenance schedules, and trust compliance reporting, also debt-free, also covenant clean. Teresa was current and ahead on her schedule, operating 310 acres with stable margins and mentoring others as required. Miguel was repaid in full, contributed back, and had rebuilt his mixed operation without reopening machinery debt. Claire was ahead on principle, with Ron assisting by choice and no longer carrying the weight of past foreclosure as private shame. Naomi's package balance had dropped below $14,000, and her reserve account had crossed 6 months of operating overhead. Tyler and Jenna Voss had renewed their lease again, with cleaner basis capture and no operating carry beyond seasonal float. Devon Cho's drainage ground had posted a third consecutive season without prevent plant loss, and he converted that stability into better lease terms. Elaine Pike still received a winter ham and a handwritten note each December, and she wrote back every year in the same careful script, always ending with the same line. Facts are kinder than pride. Mason opened the final envelope and read from the signed county audit packet. Jordan Family. Farms, LLC, and trust holdings remained at a verified net worth level consistent with the prior spring statement of $11,940,000, adjusted modestly upward after grain and landmarks, while debt service remained near zero and equipment debt remained prohibited under the trust clause. The fund page in the same packet showed a deployable balance of $1,046,000, 12 operators touched, 0 charge-offs, and acreage stabilization holding at 3,860, with measurable productivity improvements on assisted tracts. The Steigers' maintenance log showed 1 alternator belt, 1 hydraulic coupler set, and regular fluids. Still running, still useful, still fully paid for. The 1994 Chevrolet read 412,607 miles. Rust unchanged. Engine steady. Door still open from the outside because fixing it had never moved the balance sheet 1 inch. At sunset, on the last field-ready evening before winter, Eli shut off the shed lights 1 row at a time while Mason checked the latches. Clayton stood by the doorway with the audit envelope under his arm and looked across the concrete floor to the Steiger, washed and serviced, title clear in the son's operating file. Outside sat the truck that made strangers misread him for 20 years. Inside sat the machine they called scrap. Between those two objects and the ledgers that connected them, a farm had passed intact, from father to sons without leverage, taking a bite out of the handoff. The poorest-looking rig in the county had carried the strongest freedom when the numbers were finally read aloud.